Why more exposure won't help you grow your podcast. Most podcasters are experiencing what we call leaky bucket syndrome, and that's why they struggle to grow month after month. Imagine your podcast is like a bucket with holes in its side. Now, most podcasters are trying to fill up their bucket by adding more water exposure, but the more water exposure they add, the more water leaves the bucket. Leaky bucket syndrome. You first have to fix the holes of your bucket, then add water. Once you do this, the bucket not only fills to the top, but it starts overflowing. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, dude, what the hell has this got to do with growing a podcast? And I'm about to break it down because it has everything to do with growing a podcast. You see, most podcasters think that what they need to grow a podcast is more exposure. We see this time and time again. If I get more exposure on my podcast, the podcast will grow. And more exposure in this terms really means promoting on social media, bringing on high-profile guests with the hopes that this high-profile guest, this big name, a celebrity, or someone with a massive audience, that their audience will come to yours and discover your show and become a listener of your podcast. Or creating short-form clips that's going to help you get more exposure on social media with a clip going viral, or featuring as a guest on other people's podcasts. Now again, these are all different strategies that people use to get more exposure on their show. But what happens when you get exposure on a podcast that can't get listeners coming back for more? This is the question that you have to really ponder, and most podcasters completely overlook. Genuinely, what happens if you just get more exposure on a podcast that can get listeners coming back for more? It's again, think about it, right? Now, just to clarify, just because you get, let's say, 1,000 downloads this month and then 1,000 downloads the next month, it doesn't mean these are the exact same people listening to episodes from month 1 to month 2. What if the number of new listeners who are finding your show is the exact same as the number of old listeners leaving and stop listening to your show, right? If that's the case, it just means that you have more listeners coming in and old listeners who leave. This is not the same as keeping listeners coming back for more. Again, you have to fix this retention issue first, then growth becomes so much easier because you're retaining listeners long term. This is a mistake that so many podcasters make. They think just because they're growing at a slow and steady rate that they're keeping listeners coming back for more, but it's like, no, actually, you're losing listeners and you're only just by a little bit being discovered by new listeners. So look, my name is Anthony Winery. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListeners.com. This is a company helping education-based podcasters, business owners, coaches, experts in their field turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show in 6 months. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters. I'm also the co-host of the podcast Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generates around $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month. So look, what is the outcome of actually fixing your retention issues? Well, number 1, you get more listeners coming back for more. Number 2, your engagement skyrockets. Number 3, you build insane trust because your people are listening to more of your episodes. Therefore, they build the know, like, and trust. And finally, you make more money because the only way to sell to your audience, the only way to monetize is by selling stuff. And in order for you to sell stuff and make money, your listeners and audience have to buy stuff. And the only way your listeners will actually buy stuff from you is, number 1, if you're able to get them coming back for more, if they're consistently engaged with your content, and if they've built trust enough to transact with your podcast, to transact with you. That's the only way to make money from your show, whether that's them buying from you or whether that's them buying a product that you recommended because you have an affiliate or sponsorship deal. So now your podcast is overflowing in the best way possible. Now at this point, I'm thinking, okay, great, I get the whole retention issue. I see how that would help. I get why exposure won't help if you have a leaky bucket syndrome. But what the hell should I do, right? How the hell can I actually apply this to get more listeners coming back for more? How the hell do I fix the holes in my bucket, my leaky bucket syndrome? And that is exactly what I'm going to break down right now. So look, here's the exact steps that you can take to get more listeners coming back for more month after month after month after month. Number 1, have a clear USP, which stands for unique selling point. What makes your show different from other podcasts out there who are competing for the audience you want to reach? Give listeners a reason to want to stick around. Think about it. If you're in a business space or personal development podcast and you're interviewing a bunch of different people, there's so many other podcasts who are trying to do the exact same thing as you. Not even trying. They are doing the exact same thing as you. So what makes your podcast uniquely different? Is it the fact there's a daily show? Is it the fact that it's packaged in a unique way where instead of you just having a business interview, you actually do a business audit, or you break down, you break down the founding story of a specific company? The point is, you're in an industry, business, and you're thinking of unique ways to package and deliver your content in an exciting way. You need to give listeners a reason to stick around. There's so much competition out there. So if there's nothing uniquely different about your show, it makes it hard for you to stand out and makes it hard for you to gain traction fast. It makes it so difficult, right? And you might think, oh, well, what about Joe Rogan? Yeah, Joe Rogan does 3 to 4 hour interviews with literally the best, with the greatest experts on planet Earth, like quite literally the greatest expert on planet Earth, not just some subjective arbitrary thing, but that's a uniqueness in of itself. So for you, what could that be? This is so important. You can't skip this over because so many people just skip over the USP, not even thinking and realize they need one. But think about it. There's so many more podcasters publishing more and more. There's so many more episodes coming out more and more. The online space, whether it's podcast, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Reels, whatever it is becoming far more competitive to keep listeners' attention. So give them a reason to stick around. Package your show as something new and wildly attractive to the listeners you want to reach if you want them to stick around. Number 2, build a demand-based content strategy. So what you want to do, you want to build a demand-based content strategy. This is different to a normal content strategy. A normal content strategy, and in this case, a content strategy, simply means your process of picking specific topics to talk about on your show. That's your content strategy. Most people overlook this, but it's so important that you pinpoint the exact topics within your industry that's currently capturing your listeners' attention right now. Again, the listeners you want to reach, they're consuming content already on this topic. So what content are they consuming? When you build a demand-based content strategy, this is again a data-driven approach, and you're able to capture the demand that's already there rather than trying to generate it yourself. Don't guess what topics your audience likes. Build a demand-based content strategy that's backed up by data. Look on Google, look on YouTube, look on online forums. See what topics are trending within your space, within your industry. These topics will give you ideas of future episodes. Ask yourself, is there anything trending in the news right now? What topics are trending on YouTube? The biggest YouTubers, what topics are they covering and which topics get the most attention on their channel? If they're in your industry, yes, they've got a YouTube channel and you have a podcast channel, but the interest level is still the exact same for that particular topic. And this is where you're validating using Google, YouTube, online forums based on real life engagement on that specific topic. You're not just guessing and hoping based on client, based on people you're getting onto the show to have an interview with. You have a data-driven approach first, and then you reverse engineer the content based on what you know is proven to work. So once you have the topics picked, you now have to package the episodes to be attractive because you have your content strategy, but people are going to look at your content strategy by essentially looking at your back catalog. They're going to see your titles. So your titles need to be wildly attractive to turn this stranger into a listener and to keep your current listeners coming back for more. So instead of having a title that's a bit boring, like how to grow your podcast, again, a bit boring, try 5 growth murdering intro mistakes that guarantee low listener engagement and how to fix them. You see, one is a bit dry, a bit boring. The other one's far more exciting. It provokes a lot more curiosity and also provides a specific solution. So every episode needs to hit the sweet spot for your listeners. You have to repeatedly remind old and new listeners why they should listen. People's attention is getting short, so convince them. Your entire podcast is essentially a sales pitch to turn strangers into listeners and to convince your old listeners to keep coming back for more. So remember that. Number 3, focus on ranking higher on Apple and Spotify through podcast SEO. Podcast SEO is a process where you specifically are trying to rank your show higher on Apple and Spotify. You do this by adding keywords to your show name, episode titles, show notes, show descriptions, and then having a content strategy that's covering a specific topic that you want to rank for. If you have a business podcast, you talk about business. And again, business is way too broad. You'd have to be a lot more specific, like let's say, like a lead generation or, like a specific type of business model like dropshipping. These are just random examples. But the point is you find a specific topic you want to rank for on Apple and Spotify. So when new listeners search organically on these platforms, you rank high on the search results. And when you rank high in the search results, you're easily found and discovered by these new listeners. So if your podcast is optimized for podcast SEO, it means you're constantly on your listeners' feeds. And when you rank high for the right search terms, they can't forget about you. They literally can't forget about you, right? They open up Spotify, they see you. They open up Apple, they see you. But it's easy to lose new listeners who can't find you. And not ranking your podcast higher on Apple and Spotify is the best way to hide your podcast. And once you have this in place, these pieces in place, then you can think about crazy exposure strategies. And we have tons of them, like leveraging online communities to turn more of their audience members into your listeners, sponsoring newsletters or sponsoring other podcasts, or featuring as a guest on other top podcasts in your niche. These are all great ways to get exposure, but we have to start with retention first. So we build a podcast that's wildly attractive to the listeners you want to reach using a USP. We ensure it's proven to keep listeners coming back for more using a demand-based content strategy, a data-driven approach to decide what topics to cover on your show, what guests to invite on the podcast. You get your podcast ranking high on Apple and Spotify for organic growth month after month. Then and only then we add more exposure. It is literally impossible to do all the things I've just mentioned above and not grow your podcast. Literally impossible. Awesome. So let's recap. Adding more water, exposure, to your leaky bucket, a podcast that keeps losing listeners, isn't going to help you grow. It is literally impossible to grow your podcast month after month if you can't get listeners coming back for future episodes. Until you fix that, you will always suffer from leaky bucket syndrome. You have to fix the holes in your bucket first, then add water to the bucket to fill it to the top. You have to first have a podcast that get listeners coming back for more for future episodes before adding more exposure. This is the only way to grow your podcast exponentially. So things to focus on to keep listeners coming back for more. Build a USP, give your listeners a reason to actually stick around because your show is uniquely different and packaged and delivered in a unique and exciting way. Number 2, follow a demand-based content strategy. Pinpoint what's trending right now and capturing the attention of your listeners. Cover that on your podcast. Position your podcast as a valuable resource that they need to keep coming back to get the valuable insights within your industry. Number 3, optimize your show to be found on Apple and Spotify. This is how you grow. This is how clients like Lori were able to turn her growth around, right? Her podcast was literally pod fading, declining, and it wasn't until we fixed. And again, she was getting exposure, posting on social media, doing all the right things, quote unquote, but she had the leaky bucket syndrome. And it wasn't until we fixed her retention issue that she's now growing month after month after month, hitting record months and turning more of her listeners into paying clients, even with a small audience. And this isn't some fluke or some random occurrence. This happens all the time. We have clients who want to work with us when they get More Listeners Academy, our one-on-one personalized program. They want to work with us. When they come to us, they think we're going to help them with exposure and this. And we do help them with exposure. We don't start there. We start by fixing the retention issue. And once we fix the retention issue, we always see growth start moving in the right direction. So here's another example. We had another client, Whitney, who was, again, for literally 2 years, her podcast was struggling to grow. Struggling. She couldn't break past the slow and steady growth. And it wasn't until, again, we fixed our retention issue. We built out her USP, built out a demand-based content strategy, and optimized her podcast for podcast SEO. So she became easily discovered by new listeners on Apple and Spotify. That again, her podcast literally exploded, and she went from 600 downloads per month to 7,000 monthly downloads 7 months later. With Instagram, again, flooded with tons of interested leads. This is what you need to do in order to grow your show. You need to fix your leaky bucket syndrome. So there you have it. My name is Anthony Maneri. You have been absolutely fantastic. And look, if you like this and you want to follow a proven strategy to growing your podcast, feel free to click the first link down below in the description. Yes, it's going to take you to a sales page /VSL where myself and I'm going to walk you through our 4-step growth and retention system that will use to help our clients grow their shows. And if you resonate, amazing, great, awesome, we're booking a call. But if you're not interested, at least you walk away having insights of how we grow our shows. And there's no hard feelings. There's no harm done. And regardless, you can feel free to go through our YouTube channel, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment if you have any specific questions.